Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Homfransen, Executive Director of the 3AL. Welcome to our webinar on being Asian in America. We are so excited to work with our friends at the Pew Research Center to schedule this very important webinar on such a fascinating topic. I'd like to thank Neil Ruiz, Garmeng Liang, and Hannah Klein. Before I turn things over to Iris Yim, our 3AF Vice President and Marketing Research Committee Chair, I wanted to share a little bit about 3AF. I know some of you are familiar with 3AF and others of you are not. The Asian American Advertising Federation is the primary resource when it comes to Asian advertising, Asian marketing, and the power of the Asian consumer. Our members include media, marketers, agencies, researchers, and other industry vendors and partners who are champions for the Asian consumer segment. There are several ways you can engage with us. First, we'd welcome your participation as a member of 3AF. More information on the benefits of membership are on our website at 3af.org. Also, every year we organize the 3AF Asian Marketing Summit. It's the largest national conference focusing on the Asian consumer. While there are other multicultural conferences out there, ours is the only one where every single session has some tie-in or some focus on the Asian segment. We are finalizing the venue now, but it will be in May next year. Lastly, we'd welcome your participation in other ways by sponsoring, volunteering, or connecting with us on social media. Feel free to reach out to us. Wherever you are in your brand journey, if you need help with the Asian consumer segment, we are here to assist you. Many of our members have more than 30+ years of experience in our industry, and we're here to help. And now I'll turn things over to Iris Yim, our 3AF Vice President. Iris, over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Neil Ruiz. Neil is Associate Director of Race and Ethnicity Research at the Pew Research Center. He studies the international movement of people across borders, high-skilled immigration to the US and around the world, and uses different research methodologies to study Asian Americans and other populations. Prior to joining the Pew Research Center, Neil was the Executive Director of the Center for Law, Economics, and Finance at George Washington University. And he has also worked as a migration and economic development expert at the Brookings Institution, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. Today, he is going to share with us highlights from a study recently released from the Pew Research Center on Asian Americans. The study explores the experiences and views of Asian Americans. It includes 66 focus groups, a very ambitious study, with a total 264 participants that covers 18 distinct Asian ethnic origin groups. Discussions took place in 18 languages and were moderated by members of the participants' own ethnic groups. We know that Asian American is a very diverse community, but due to limited resources, oftentimes, when we conduct market research, we can only cover a handful of the largest subgroups in research. So it's quite a rare chance that we get to hear the voices from some of the smaller groups, such as Bhutanese, Burmese, Cambodian, just to name a few. So now I am going to hand it over to Neil, and he will share with us what it means to be Asian in America.
Thank you so much, Iris, for having me. It's a great pleasure to be speaking here at 3AF. I remember going to the wonderful conference that you had several years ago, pre-pandemic in Los Angeles, and I just remember such a vibrant community at 3AF. So today I'll be talking about a recent Pew Research Center study that we just released last August, and really about giving voice to the diversity of Asian Americans living in the United States. This is part of a multi-year project on looking at Asians in the United States, and this is more of the qualitative phase, as Iris said, based on 66 focus groups. But we will also have another phase that's going to be more quantitative that we'll be releasing. We're excited about it next year. But first off, just a little bit about here at Pew Research Center and just in general, the public opinion research industry. As many of you know, there's an election like next week in a few days. So when you watch CNN, Fox News, PBS or NBC, whatever who you watch in the media, you know that there usually will be, reporting out on different racial ethnic groups in it, but it's usually white, Black, Hispanic, and other. So Asians are usually missing. But I really believe, we at Pew Research Center and myself believe that, public opinion research needs to provide kind of the full voice of all Americans. As our center's founding documents say, fact-based information is the fuel democracies run on. It's the raw material for which societies can identify problems and formulate solutions. You can't do that if you don't know exactly what is going on, the voices of the populations, but not just all populations and all the different voices that can be heard.
Neil, I'm sorry, could I interrupt? We're getting some comments that your slides are not centered. They're kind of a little cut off. I believe you have to move the PowerPoint into the green box. Sorry to interrupt.
Let me see. Oh, it's on the. Oh, I'm screen sharing. Okay, I see. Hold on. Let me just.
Okay.
Apologies, everyone. Let me just put. Where is it? Is this? I don't know why it's not giving me the PowerPoint. Is that better?
That's better.
Okay, yeah, so it's not full screen. If I do full screen, what happens? Does that work? No.
No.
Let me just. I think I'll just do it this way. Can everyone see this?
Is everyone, yeah, can everyone see that better than the last?
Yes, at least it's not cut off.
Yeah, it's not cut off. Okay, let's go.
Is that better? Okay, I widened it a little bit.
Okay.
So, but in order to include voices of Asian Americans is quite challenging. There are several, like 3 challenges that I'll talk about. First, usually we're all treated as one monolithic group. So here's a typical survey we do here at Pew Research Center and other people in the industry do. In order to survey Asian adults, usually you only offer them, a lot of surveys are offered either in English or Spanish. So your Asian sample, those who are surveyed or asked questions, are only interviewed in English. But we know that the Asian American population is largely immigrant. Its majority actually are immigrants in the United States. And we know that we can't assume that all of them are also English proficient. So you would be missing large sectors of the Asian American population if you don't offer it beyond English, but in language in the different Asian languages. We also know that this big 6, Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese, make up 85% of the nation's Asian population. But what about other people who are Asian, but under Pakistani, Nepalese, Burmese? Their voices kind of get hidden in a survey among the big 6 who make up 85%. And also, when you look at states, who you're talking about, like next week it's going to be elections, so you're going to talk about who's the biggest Asian population kind of in each state. It differs too. So if you're in California, it's Chinese Americans, or if you're in Florida or New Jersey, it's Indian Americans. But if you're in Minnesota or Wisconsin, you're talking about the Hmong population. They tend to be the largest in that state. So the next challenge is that there's a diversity of origins and economic circumstances of Asian Americans. We all come from, even though the same continent, but very different starting points. And income actually shows the diversity within. So Indian Americans have the highest median household income, whereas those who are Burmese and come in more as refugees, like Lao or Vietnamese Hmong, are much more lower because they started in America in a very different circumstances. Whereas Indian Americans, many have been selected as H-1B or foreign students who came into the US or in employment-based visas. That has a very different selection criteria, which means a different demographic that came into the US and a different starting point. Also, we know different poverty rates. So those who are Mongolian, Burmese, Bangladeshi, much higher percent are living under poverty, whereas Indian, Filipino, Japanese are not. And in education as well, everyone always says, Asians are doing well educationally, but if you disaggregate the data, you could see there's also diversity within where not everyone has a bachelor's degree or above, and it's actually quite low for Bhutanese, Lao, Hmong, Burmese. And the last challenge is language. So if you do surveys and you don't do it in language, And if you do it in language, it's expensive. So look at this. This is a look at the Asian immigrants, those who are foreign-born, born abroad, and are living in the United States. And you can see, depending on origin, English proficiency varies. So Indian, Malaysian, Sri Lankans have high proficiency in English. So if you survey them in English, likelihood you'll capture a majority of the population. But if they're Burmese, Bhutanese, Vietnamese, Hmong, a very small percentage are English proficient in the United States. So by not offering in English in our surveys, you're really not capturing them. So what do we do at Pew Research Center? As Iris noted, I designed this project to really understand, to really get the diversity of voices, to include the diversity of voices in public opinion research. So that's what accumulated into this big data essay publication on what it means to be Asian in America, which was designed with, I don't know if everyone can see this, but this is like 66 focus groups in 18 different Asian origin groups and in 18 different languages. So we really, and also all moderated by members of their ethnic groups so that people could build rapport and really be open about what they were conversing in the 2-hour conversations. And we had diversity also within income, diversity of, nativity, those who were born in the US, those who immigrated to the US, and those who came within the last 10 years versus those who came more than 10 years ago. And what we did is that we took all these 132 hours of transcripts in 18 different languages, translated them all into English, and also used what was Atlas TI, it's a software, to really code to understand all of what the themes that were emerging from these discussions. So I'll just talk about 3 buckets, broad buckets of what we talked about. One is identity. What did Asians tell us on how they identify? In our focus groups, we really wanted to tease out how do Asian Americans identify? Your race, Asian American, your ethnicity, Bhutanese American, American identity, or combination of both? What resonated? And what we learned is that there's no simple answer. So from the focus groups, we heard, for instance, someone who's Burmese who's more on the racial identity side, identifying as Asian, says, quote, most people don't know where Burma is, so I just say Asian. But then you have other people, a Cambodian participant who said, quote, Asian is so broad, I am Cambodian. So there was a wide range of answers, and it was very interesting to see what emerged and the reasons why people chose to identify one way over the other. And what we heard here, there were kind of 2 themes, and there's more, but these are 2 that stood out. One was that smaller ethnic groups defaulted to Asian since their groups are less recognizable. For instance, here's an immigrant woman of Bhutanese origin who said, quote, coming to a big country like the US, when people ask where you're from, there are some people who have no idea about Bhutan. So we end up introducing ourselves as being Asian. Then we have about our South Asian community. It's actually quite interesting, where the Asian label just didn't necessarily fit them. So here's a US-born woman of Indian origin who is talking about South Asian, or Desi, as an identity that more resonated with her than the Asian identity. So a lot of people really talked about it, especially those from South Asia, like Bangladesh, Nepal, India, Pakistan. Then we also heard this kind of theme that was running across all focus groups about how do you balance, following individual dreams or individualistic thinking, or your collective thinking, what your cultural heritage or your parents or your grandparents or where you came from, that cultural, what's informing how you behave, right? So here's a US-born man of Indian origin who's really talking about how you kind of like follow your dreams, if it's being American, to be individualistic, but sometimes it could clash with kind of your family, like wanting to be there with your family, and then also what your culture is informing you. A next big bucket is about how do others treat Asians and see and treat them. And what's interesting here is that we found that there was a disconnect between how respondents' identity and how others see and treat them. Let me give you an example. Model minority came up a lot in a lot of our focus groups. And here's a woman, a US-born woman of Korean origin in her late 20s who kind of really resonated this kind of dichotomy or this dilemma that a lot of Asian Americans are dealing with. Quote, as an Asian person, I feel like there's that stereotype that Asian students are high achievers academically. They're good at math and science. I was pretty mediocre student, and math and science were actually my weakest subjects. So feel like either way you lose. Teachers expect you to fit a certain stereotype, and if you're not, then you're a disappointment. But at the same time, even if you are good at math and science, that just means you're just fitting a stereotype. It's actually your own achievement, but your teachers might think, oh, it's because they're Asian, and that diminishes your achievement. So this is a really interesting theme that was we were seeing about the model of minority and its impact on people. Whether you were fitting the stereotype and doing well in school or in math and science, it was no longer your individual achievement. It was being kind of Asian. But then also the other end, if you're not good, they said there's something wrong with you because you're supposed to be good because you're Asian. So it's kind of interesting how that came across. Another one is a forever foreigner mentality. Whether they were born in the United States or they were immigrated to the US from abroad, Asian Americans were really felt like they were being seen and currently seen as foreigners. So we heard, for instance, this immigrant woman of Filipino origin, she was really talking about this question that may be kind of innocent for some people because they're curious, asking you, where are you from? And then they usually ask a follow-up question, where are you? You say, I'm from California. It's like, well, where are you really from? And you probably say your city, like I'm from Los Angeles. And they're like, well, where are you really, really from? So we heard that across the focus groups of this frustration of an underlying assumption, even if the people have good intentions of being curious, it just kind of resonated, that bothered people, like thinking that you're not really belonging in America. Then the last theme is about what does it mean to be home in America for Asian Americans? We participants overall were taking pride in their cultural heritage. I mean, many people told us it took time, like when they were children, especially for our US born immigrants, that they had to, it evolved over time. When they were younger, sometimes they were trying to fit in America and they didn't want to, they wanted to do, because they were the only Asian person in their class. So they were trying to do things to fit in. Other people were telling us if they weren't the only Asian in the class, they usually kind of, sometimes they were probably felt more comfortable or were able to kind of, people understood them. So it's kind of interesting to hear that. And here's a quote from an immigrant man of Indian origin who really kind of captures this duality, this dual national identity that many, whether you're an immigrant and sometimes when you're US born, that you deal with. So it's like, quote, just like there's Chinese American, Mexican American, Japanese American, Italian American, so there is Indian American. I don't want to give up Indianness. I'm American by nationality, but I am Indian by birth. So whenever I talk, I try to show both the flags as well, both Indian and American flags, just because you make new relatives, but don't forget the old relatives. This is a dilemma that many people deal with, but I think it's what people were telling us, it's something beautiful about being American is about blending their cultural heritage, that where you came from, or your parents came from, or your grandparents came from, and also paving the way of your own path in America and blending both together. So you could see all this. We're excited. It's all on our website, all the quotes from the over 264 participants in 18 different languages. We translated them, of course, in English, but you could sort through the 18 different origin groups. You could go through this interactive and type if you want to hear from a Sri Lankan woman, if you want to hear from an immigrant Korean by age or generation. All their quotes are here on what they told us of what does it mean to be them living in America. And then we also have a documentary sprinkled through the publication. If you read it online, you will see some of our video participants that we had. They weren't part of the focus groups, but these video participants really highlight a lot of the themes and discussions that we heard in the focus groups. We had stories from, on the upper right, you had a woman who survived a Japanese incarceration, as she was there as a young child, and talks about her story about having to go through that very confusing time for her. And then you have in the upper left, Hmong American woman who was born in the United States, trying to navigate, being among and trying to kind of the expectations of being an Hmong American woman, as well as trying to follow your own dreams and being an American woman of Hmong descent and trying to go to build her own career and go to college. So all these stories are all kind of summed up in a 30-minute video documentary that we have, and I will play a 2-minute clip from it. But you could see all this on our website here at pewresearch.org on Being Asian in America, the data essay, this publication, the video, the interactive quote sorter, they're all there. And really, we're just so excited. A lot of people have reacted saying that they finally see themselves in a Pew kind of in public opinion research or in a Pew kind of report. And there's more to come. So hopefully by May next year, we are in the middle of a survey right now we're feeling the largest probability survey of Asian Americans. And we'll be reporting out starting in May onwards. So we're very excited about that. So I will just stop right there, but I will share my video. Let me see if this will share screen. Okay, and here we go. It's about a couple minutes.
I think I straight up just identify myself as a Chinese American woman. I think it's very important to mention the fact that like where my parents are from, where who I am, and then where I was born, America.
When I came to the US, I was 5 years old, and I remember feeling confused. I remember feeling, which one is my home? Because I was young enough that I didn't really remember a full experience of being in Laos. But I also remember thinking, I don't fit in here. And as a young child, it was just very confusing. Am I Lao? Am I American?
When I was growing up, I felt definitely Chinese. But I felt I was Chinese American because I was born in America. But I felt that others didn't see me as being an American-born Chinese. They saw me as just being Chinese.
I would say that having lived overseas, American is first and foremost my identity.
Theo tôi thì dù sống ở đâu thì tôi vẫn là một người Việt Nam. Mặc dù sống ở Mỹ đã vào quốc tịch nhưng tôi vẫn là một người Mỹ gốc Việt. Theo tôi thì các cháu sinh ra ở Mỹ và lớn lên ở đây thì các cháu có một cái lối suy nghĩ Mỹ nhiều hơn Việt Nam.
I identify myself as Sikh American, and when it comes to saying that Sikh American, I bring my Sikh values and then I adopt the American system, American values, and I combine them together into a good human being and a good citizen of this place, which I have now started calling my home for 20-some years.
When I talk to people, when I first introduce myself, I definitely say I'm Hmong and I'm a Hmong American woman. I think it's very hard to separate Hmong and American. When it comes down to it, I might say I'm Hmong first, actually, but I would say that I carry both of those contexts with me. And I think also being a woman is very important to me because as a woman, it's very different also in the Hmong community. Sometimes it's even hard to explain to other Asian Americans how I feel as an Asian American woman, you know. And when I see someone, I have a friend who's actually Chinese, and talking to her, we're so close, but even trying to share my experiences is difficult because our experiences are not the same, even though we're perceived as both Asian American women, right?
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Neil, for that presentation, sharing with us the highlights of your study. Well, now we're going to open the floor for questions. While you're all thinking about it, so I have a few questions for Neil to get us started.
Yeah.
So obviously it's a very ambitious study that includes 18 ethnic groups, you know, in the study. So how did you decide on those 18 groups to conduct the research on, and why is it important for you to include all these different, you know, ethnic groups, not just the few largest subgroups?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So the 18, I mean, there are more than 18 Asian origin groups. So we had to, based on budget, we had to select, we selected the largest as well as also for diversity. So some that were also bigger, but had a different experience, like bringing refugees. We wanted to make sure we highlighted different kind of starting points for Asian Americans. I thought this was really important to do. I think it's because when you look at survey research, and as we saw, 85% of the Asian American population is the big six. And so the big six don't necessarily speak for the experiences of Hmong Americans, like you saw from Pahao in the documentary, saying, I'm very different from my Chinese, even we're close friends. We're very different. So we really wanted to capture that. And that's why we spent a lot of time in these focus groups, 2 hours, to really talk about identity, understand if there was patterns of how they were experiencing discrimination, understanding if there were different views of, experiences of immigrating to the US. And we heard very different stories, some that were similar experiences, but different. Just to give you 2 highlights, when it comes to discrimination, it was fascinating. We heard from our Japanese American focus groups that many of them were either children or at the time during incarceration, or heard from their parents or grandparents about the time. And they were wondering, why am I in Colorado? Why am I living over here? And we're the only, they didn't know. And they were telling us they were moving to Colorado because they couldn't own land in California. People forgot that, there was a time when California really, where people were sent to internment camps. And I think, and in our South Asian focus groups, they in particular, especially our Pakistani focus groups, were telling us about after 9/11, not all of them experienced some form of discrimination. Some really harsh, like being stopped in TSA and airports, and some really being vandalized in their businesses. So you had all these kind of very harsh times. So it gave us kind of a understanding of, this is what was happening at this moment when we did this study in the pandemic, that COVID-19 and rise of anti-Asian hate, this is nothing new. This has also been happening historically in other big moments in time, like Japanese incarceration and 9/11.
Right. So obviously, identity is an important theme and a topic that you focus in this study. Why is it important for you to focus on identity, Asian American identity specifically?
Yeah, identity was everyone, we take that, I think sometimes we take that identity for granted, right? People always have, we wanted to tease that out because we don't know, we can't assume, does everyone identify as Asian? Even though we have a label, we have census, it's simple categorizations so that you could label the race, ethnicity, makeup of America, right? But then we also know they all come from different experiences, right? And they're very unique. Something, Filipinos are very different from the experiences of Indian versus Burmese or Bhutanese, or those. There's a very different experience from, especially since there's a high immigrant population. We know they're different. Right? Someone coming as a refugee who didn't even plan on coming to the US would have an entirely different starting point than someone who was coming to the US as a foreign student, getting educated, and then finding a job in the US and getting a green card, right? So that's a very different path. And we wanted to understand how are people identifying, how is it impacting them differently, and also helping us understand our different circumstances.
Right. And also, I understand that there's a huge difference between, for example, US-born Asians and foreign-born Asians, right?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one, too. Yes.
Right. So obviously, you have conducted a lot of studies on Asian Americans. So are there any surprises to you in the findings from this research compared to other Asian research that you have conducted? Because this one is obviously very different in terms of scope, the number of ethnic groups, Asian ethnic groups that's covered, and also number of languages the study is conducted in.
Yeah, I really enjoyed doing this study. It was hard. I have to be honest. This is hard. As even market researchers, if anyone market researchers here, this is really hard work, especially once you start adding a second language. Can you imagine 18, right? And we had a moderator guide that was guiding all the moderators for every single step for every different group. And we had different moderators. So that was a real big kind of study. But I really thought it was very important. One thing of the surprise, not necessarily surprise, but there are two surprises. There's a lot of commonality. There are differences. There are a lot of differences, like either points in time of how you've been treated, different points in time of how you immigrated, different experiences of income situations or job. Visa situations are very different if you're an immigrant. But we did see commonalities about US born. Like a lot of people are struggling with navigating what it means to be, a dash American, or if they're American, or learning their parents' heritage and trying to navigate kind of what their parents are telling them to do. I mean, one of the things that was really fascinating that I thought was hearing the voices of US born focus groups participants telling us, some of them were kind of telling us they didn't like it when their parents were telling them that they had to, go to extra school on the weekend, math and science camp, or language school, Sunday school. So people were telling us, I wanted to just be American. I wish I was going to Boy Scout, Girl Scout, and going out on the weekends, or going on different adventures. I was like, why did my parents make me do that? Then we heard from the actual kind of people who were parents, and they were telling us in their language, telling us, you know what, I didn't know the language here in the US. All I knew from my other friends that I learned from is to provide the best I can for my kids. And what I knew to do is invest in making them go to these math and science camps and Saturday schools. So it was interesting because, and then they were saying this, they were telling us, because I can't provide for them. I don't know how to navigate America. I don't know the language well. I don't know the American system. All I knew was to save money as much as possible and provide everything I can for my kids. And then you hear the kids, the US born, later in life telling us, I know I was so frustrated. I was mad at my parents who were making me do all this stuff. But now I understand they were trying to do this because they didn't know America and they didn't understand this. And I was rejecting them. And sometimes people feel sorry. I was rejecting my parents just to fit in high school, but not realizing what they were trying to do is help me the best way they can. So that, when I look collectively, because I watched all 66 focus groups, right? It's just fascinating to hear that story. And it's like, there was like a dialogue, there was a conversation that was going on that US born Asian Americans don't realize until later in life. And maybe they will never, sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. But there was this like realization of appreciation for their parents, even though they didn't know the system. And then for parents, there was that need to provide, and also the not knowing what to do and trying to provide as much as possible. So it was just fascinating to see that. I think collectively, when I think about all this, that was one of the most interesting things that I saw. I saw all these dialogues, even though they're not the same parent and children, it was just all emerging.
Right. Well, my children are telling me the same thing. Why do I have to learn Chinese?
Yeah. I have to say, I'll chime in here, Neil. I'm one of those kids that were complaining to my parents, why are you making me go to Chinese school? But now I know, and you're absolutely right. You're what you said about how the parents want to provide and do the best they can, not knowing the culture, and just do whatever they can for their kids. So Iris, I do see some questions in the chat box. I don't know if you can see them, but I can read them. There's several actually.
I don't see them.
Okay, maybe it's set so I can see them. So here's one, Neil. Do you see a difference or shift in the duality of culture and language by ages? Is the younger generation, mid-20s, mid-30s, US born, strongly holding on to culture and language, or is it shifting?
That's a great question. So I can't generalize for everybody, but what I can tell you is when I'm hearing the focus groups, it depends. I know that's it really does depend. So for instance, we had people who were focus groups. We divided them up and we asked a screener questionnaire asking if they live around people like themselves. Do they live in a neighborhood that's around people like themselves, or people are all different, or the only Asian, right? And we noticed that a lot of the people who were living around being the only Asian, depending on the place, it mattered, right? Sometimes people were pressured as kids to kind of fit in because no one understood who they are. They couldn't explain. They were made fun of bringing food. We hear the story, the lunchbox story, about how you bring, it's usually a rice dish. And I know because I've had that experience with myself. You bring it the first, second grade, you know, the leftovers from your parents the night before, and then people would make fun of you. And then you would tell your parents, oh, please don't let me bring that. Can you give me peanut butter and jelly sandwich? We heard that a lot. So that's like, I would call that fitting in, because they're being made fun of. They're trying to protect themselves, right? But then you have some of the people who were in more diverse backgrounds or schools that were more or neighborhoods that are celebrating diversity. This happened in big urban areas, some areas, and then they were okay to embrace that. So I think it really mattered on the neighborhood and the type of school. That it's not a, there's not a one all fits all, but I think there's something going on with the generation. I think it's all cyclical, because I think as adults later on, people regret or hoping that they were able to be appreciating their backgrounds more. But the people who were able to appreciate younger, it was interesting about the environment. Like people were talking about some schools were celebrating diversity and making you want to talk about your heritage more. But then some places didn't, because they were the only one. Let me give you one sad example. I remember there was one woman as an adult, but she was talking about it. When she was a kid, she was the only Indian American in Tennessee in her high school. And she was, you know, doing well. She was in a private school, a Christian private school. And she wasn't Christian, but she was just, you know, in school. But she was called out of her in school. They were wondering, oh, we don't see you at church. And then she was like, oh no, my parents are Hindu. And then she was like, they're like, oh, and then they had a whole assembly and prayed on her. I mean, all good intentions. I would say people have good intentions in anyone's belief system, but in a school, in a public assembly, and it made her feel very different. So the parents took her out and put her in a Catholic school. But even though she was a top student, she was like getting A+ on Bible, like all this stuff, but she felt different and was called out publicly for it. So it made her feel like that was a disaster for her self-esteem, and her parents were like, oh my gosh, I can't do that. Even though people may have some good intentions too. But so that's, that happens to people.
Wow, wow. Okay, here's another question. Some say Asians' collective experience of anti-Asian racism during the pandemic strengthened the racial identity of Asians. Have you noticed such during the research, or what is your response?
That's a great question. And we, of course, had extensive conversations about discrimination in the focus groups. And then people were, of course, couldn't ignore COVID-19 and all the rise of anti-Asian hate. So I think we did hear some people who knew about, they knew about the rise of anti-Asian hate, and they were looking to groups to inform them what to do. So you did see that unity in terms of like, what do I do? Right? So they're like, here's the phone number. There's actually a phone number you could call for anti-Asian hate. So you could call if there's action, if you see it or witness it, or you're a bystander, immediately take action. So in that sense, you see some sense of uniting and some sense of the information coming from that unity sprinkling into people.
Yeah.
But then in other senses, I mean, it's different too. Like we had heavy conversations about who is Asian, like, and how you're perceived. So sometimes we're treated differently too, right? So we heard some from our Indian American participants, like who were mistaken for being Hispanic, or actually Filipinos too. They told us they were arrested for being mistaken for being a different race. So it's not a clean cut, all Asians the same experience, but sometimes they have a kind of like, are mistaken for other racial and ethnics, and they have to deal with discrimination from being mistaken too. So I don't know if there's unity going on inside, but depending on how you look, I think the outside world also treats you differently. But maybe there's also unity across, not even just with Asians, but across with other racial ethnic groups that also have to deal with the same type of discrimination issues.
That's interesting. Okay, here's another question. Okay, based on what you heard from participants in terms of how they self-describe their identity without selecting from a list, Will that influence the way you ask race or ethnicity identity questions in your surveys going forward? And if so, how?
Very good question. I could tell this is a researcher.
I know.
So yes, you have to. So I know a lot of people want to do a clean cut box. We still follow, a lot of us have to follow kind of what the census takes lead. And I remember us having a conversation about census a couple of years ago before 2020. But I think because that helps us provide the sampling frame to be able to do the survey. So we still have to follow that. But you also don't want to be hard on making it only one box. You want a lot of people to multiple choice, like they could select more than one, they could write in. So we have a lot of in our survey, we have write-ins, and we actually give examples because we want to make sure that people understand that that's an option, because we don't want to make sure people feel excluded. Because I know this could be, and there's also political categories, right? So I know that, we have Chinese, but what do you mean? Chinese or Taiwanese? Taiwanese sometimes is included, sometimes it's not. You really have to be as open as possible. So we were influenced with the idea that you need to give as many options so that people can really choose how they identify. It's all important about how people self-identify.
Mhm.
And I know there's some identities that are being, are very political time, and it's important for people to express themselves. So we make sure that we are able to be as open as possible for people to have multiple, as many choices that they can self-identify.
Okay. Here's a related question that came in the chat. Has there been any data on mixed race Asians and how they identify and what their experiences are?
That's a really, really good question. So we know from the demographic data that there is a rise of multiracial Asian Americans. So we know this is especially among Koreans and Filipinos are actually very high on this for being multiracial. And I think one thing in particular, on Japanese Americans in particular, actually Japanese is the most.
Yeah.
And what's interesting here is that we did in our focus groups, we did have some multiracial Americans who were in the focus groups, and they were kind of telling us stories about how do they navigate between being both and two racial. Of course, our study purpose was not to study multiracial Americans, but that's something we've done in 2015, and we plan on doing it again in the near future. But I think there's a lot of questions there. It's interesting from the focus groups hearing how people decide to choose one identity over the other. Like people are telling us it's actually practical. It's like, well, my mom took care of more of me. My mom brought me to Japan and introduced me to the culture, whereas I didn't go to my father's, in Peru, for instance, right? Like, so I remember we had one participant kind of telling us, why do you resonate more with one over the other? Or are you one new category, right? So that's something that we would love to explore more, but there's a lot more to do. Multiracial is quite complicated, but I think that's something we look forward to doing.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. Okay, here's a question. Did any of your research participants describe any experiences with anti-Asian hate sentiments from COVID-19?
Yes, we did have, unfortunately, people telling us about, it mostly came from slurs, and we did surveys on this too. So just so everyone know, we did a survey last year and the year before, back in 2020, 2021, and then actually just updated in 2022, seeing the rise of how Asian Americans are being discriminated. And we hear like the typical slurs, right? Or being made fun of, or people blaming you bluntly for COVID-19, right? So that came up in the focus groups and as well in our surveys. So that was something that could come up.
Yeah. Okay, so here's another question. How difficult was it to recruit participants? I think you said 18 ethnic groups.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, a lot of partnering, a lot of, because you have to have trust as well, right? Just because, what organization you're at, you have to make sure people understand, why am I doing this? I mean, of course, they'll have an incentive to come in and talk about their lives, but you also need to have trusted messengers. So we had to really we had a large team outside of even that we work closely with, that were really in the communities and understood the various 18 different Asian ethnic origin groups, because everyone is different. Some will be, recruited through the churches, some recruited from different kind of organizations. So I think it was really important to get trusted messengers and trusted who were kind of had a high reputation in the community so that you could actually recruit them. You just can't go there and say, here you go. We're Pew Research Center coming to a focus group. I mean, they're not going to know. They're not going to trust you. So it's important to be able to be in the community or have people who are in the community.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, here's an intergenerational question. Someone wants to know, were there stories emerging with adult children and aging parents? You know, we call it, I guess, the sandwich generation. We have to take care of our own kids, and then we're also having to take care of our parents.
Yes, that was interesting. We did hear from some of the focus groups about this dilemma of, and we even heard it from our elderly Asian Americans, like the expectation of taking care of your kids or taking care of your parents, right? That is something that in Asia, it's usually expected. And then we did hear from some folks that, you know, sometimes they remove that expectation in their heads, like who become, you know, retired, and they don't want to put pressure on their kids to take care of them. So we heard that dilemma, and we heard it from children too. Like they want to also help their parents and give back. And actually some people had families living with them, their parents living with them or their in-laws living with them, because it is just how they grew up and also how they're. But you did see this tension too sometimes, because sometimes people don't want to bother their kids because they're also, some of them are in their careers and they think that they can't take care of them. But that is something that is there. And that is not, I mean, we know we have, based on the demographic data from the census, we know we have a very high multi-generational households among Asian Americans. So this is something that is, that's the data showing. And we did hear a little bit about the dilemmas of how the expectations and like that. It's sad to hear like some of them saying that, you know, I don't want a burden on my kids. And then dismissing the idea that they would have their kids take care of them sometimes because they think it's being a burden. But then also some kids would think that the children thinking that it's important for them to do that because that's what they learned. So yeah, it's a big dilemma.
Yeah. Okay, this is another interesting question. You know, the midterm elections are just days away. Have you had a chance to explore Asian American voter values, important issues, and political influence?
So we haven't. Unfortunately, our survey is still in the field now because it's a long kind of census type of survey. So we won't know until May. So unfortunately, we won't be able to tell you about midterms. But what I can tell you is that the Asian American eligible voters is large. It's been growing, and it's the largest it has been. But we do know it's different by origins. But we'll have the data more in the survey, so more next year.
Yeah, we'll look forward to that. Okay, I see another question. Do you feel like Asians in America in 2022, as we see more second to fifth generations being more bilingual or preferring more English, that they are less receptive to in-language advertising? Did that really come up in your study?
So in terms of the issue of language?
Yeah, the preferred language, I guess, is more the question.
I mean, that's a really good question. I think we did ask people if it was important for to have materials in language. Actually, we have that in our survey, so more to come in May. Like I just realized that we have that actual question, and it has it in different scenarios. But I think we did have a large discussion on language in the focus groups. One thing that came out is not related directly to advertising, but we did hear the dilemma of especially parents or especially people who recently immigrated and they're adults and then having a job and then the challenges of trying to learn English and also navigate their job at the same time. That's been a hard thing for many immigrants, especially Asian Americans who are immigrants, especially in their productive years. So it's harder for them to learn English. So I don't know if that's an answer for making sure maybe in language is still important for certain groups that you're targeting.
Yeah. Okay, here's a question. Did the topic of Asian guilt appear in your research study?
So what do you mean by Asian guilt? I'm curious.
I don't know. The person who answered that, asked that question, if you want to put in the chat box a little bit more description. If not,
Guilty of being Asian, or
just, maybe feeling guilty of not being always the best, or
the
rising to
Asian
the
guilt of
top.
not.
And
Yes.
you know.
So going back to that quote that I talked about in a model minority and its impact. Yeah, we heard that. I mean, actually, Diane, who you heard in the documentary, talks extensively about this.
Yeah.
She
Or
talks,
just,
and a lot of people like this, like, I'm not good enough
yeah.
to be Asian, or and it's pretty sad because we all know we're all different and have different, I mean, just as humans, right, have and they're trying to express that, but there's also this there is that sentiment. It came from a lot of teachers. Like, we heard from people, they're like, oh, teachers were disappointed, they were giving me a chance, they thought I would be in advanced math or
Yeah.
science, and then suddenly I didn't do well, so then they'd just like, oh,
Right. I got an A- instead of an A. Oh no, gonna hide my
oh,
face.
she should be in that. Like, okay, she's not really, and exactly what Diane and all of them are saying, they're not really fitting the Asianness, right? So yeah. Oh, I think you're muted.
You're still muted. Jenny, we cannot hear you.
Sorry about that. Are there any other questions? Please put them in the chat box and I will read them out to Neil. I think I've gotten most of them. Okay, here. Okay, how about this one? When looking at themes for the needs and challenges of various Asian groups, were there any distinct groupings that were noteworthy versus the monolith needs of the Asian American diaspora?
So when we talked to, because we had focus groups by nativity, so we had immigrants, those who were, and it was particularly refugees. Those who came in the United States as refugees were particularly, it was very different because a lot of them didn't have families here. They were usually sponsored by whether a church or an organization. And we heard from them that, one, they were grateful. A lot of them were grateful for being sponsored and being able to escape, especially a lot of people, especially from Laos, Cambodia, or Hmong, were being able to be sponsored. But we did see different needs. For instance, there was a large cluster of Cambodian refugees who are in Long Beach, California. And what's interesting there is that people told us the school, when they went to school, there was a large population of Cambodians, but then there was not even one Khmer speaker or a teacher. So no one knew how to translate them. So they were telling us, a lot of our Cambodian participants were kind of telling us, when I was in high school, I came here and like, I was just sitting in class, not knowing what's going on. And it's because of the language issue. We also heard stories of, and you'll see in the documentary of one of the Cambodian participants, how it's the issue of health. It's a life or death situation, right? They're in a hospital having to describe what is going on in their body. And so a doctor could make the sound decision of what to do to save someone's life. And if you don't have an interpreter, so they have to figure out who's going to help. So he was talking about how there's a Cambodian organization that actually they were able to find, and then someone was a Khmer speaker to actually help translate to the doctor. But those are life or death situations. Those are educational situations. Those things came up a lot. And I think that that was kind of like a challenge from some of these people saying, we didn't have this when we were, even though there was a large proportion of our population who were in certain neighborhoods.
Yeah. Okay, here's another follow-up question related to the language. It's more of a, I guess, procedural question on the study. Was the survey extended in their language or preference or in their native language from the start? So did they have a choice to do the study, the research questionnaire, English versus native language?
Oh, so the survey to screen them, we had it
Your
in
survey,
we had it in they had a choice in the 2 different languages, or for that's targeting them. So all the 18 languages, but And that kind of gave us an indication. We also asked questions about proficiency so that we want to make sure that if they're in a group that they would be able to, whether they should be in English or not. But most of our actually all our immigrant focus groups, those who were born abroad, were in dual language.
Oh, okay. Okay, more questions are coming in. Let's see. This is interesting. Did you hear about willingness to form alliances with Latinos and Blacks to counter prejudice and increase opportunities? Especially, you know, with the country's newfound focus on diversity and the power of our ethnic communities. Somebody asked that question.
It was interesting. That's a great question. And it was interesting as we did ask that came up, and it came up in multiple ways. People were very honest and open. So some people were telling us not, right? Some people were saying, well, a lot of people, the experience of certain racial groups are targeting us. So we heard that. But we also heard some people saying, you know what, we're more aligned with some people who are more immigration experience. So we're finding, like, I know we had some participants from Texas who were telling us that we are very similar to a lot of Hispanics here in Texas who also have the same issues that we're dealing with immigration, same issues with language, different language, but same experience with trying to get a green card, same experience with trying to get citizenship. So it seems like the immigration experience came across commonality among other racial ethnic groups that are immigrants. But then you also saw, we did ask questions about, this is a very hot topic. We did not publish on this, but it of course came up on affirmative action. And that's being talked about right now because the Supreme Court. But we did across, and we'll report this out later, but it was fascinating to see across the board, people really believe that in principle, it's important to have racial ethnic diversity and representation. And everyone thinks it's a good thing, except people who knew more about what the weeds of the process of the program, where some people were saying, well, but it doesn't work in practice, or there's some issues, some tweaks that need to be made, all those things. So we heard a whole lot of different opinions, and people were not all collectively in the same opinion. So, but our survey will actually enlighten us on that. We will have that before. I would assume that the Supreme Court will rule in June. So we'll have something to tell us about that too.
Super, super. Okay, in our next 3 minutes, are there any more questions? Iris, I know you had a few too. I think I've gotten most of the ones in the chat. Any?
Well, okay, so yeah, I have to have one.
I know
So
Iris always has questions.
Given that a lot of our audience, they are in advertising and marketing. So based on the findings, what messaging should they focus on to make their communication more effective and to foster a stronger connection with Asian consumers?
That's a good question. So I will be able to get more on the surveys because I want to make sure it's representative, but we'll have answers from the survey. But I think just off the top of my head from focus groups, there is a shared experiences among Asian American. I mean, the immigration experience is very similar, right? Dealing with kind of blending two different cultures, that's there, the duality. So I say that that's something that came up, and I think that would resonate with people. I'm just thinking about just in pop culture, think about like Mindy Kaling, like what she does with her shows and how she writes kind of, you're thinking about your audience, right? So she's showing the Indian American experience, but she's also showing how it's similar or different from all the other different racial ethnic groups. I think your audience for Asian Americans in general, I mean, of course, depending on who you're targeting is different by origin. So you'll have to be sensitive to that. But I think that immigration experience, the dilemma of blending the heritage, whether it's from your parents, yourself, where you came from, your grandparents or great-grandparents, and then being American, I think that's kind of there, that story, that collective story of what it means to be American, and an Asian American in particular, I think is there, and we heard it across all focus groups.
Yeah. Great, well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This is fun.
Yeah, so we're just about out of time. I want to just thank all of our participants and just everyone for all these great questions. that you put in the chat box. Neil, thank you so much for your expertise and sharing the slides with us and just this embarking on this big study. We were just so impressed and wanted to invite you. And so thank you for your time today. Also want to do a big shout out to your staff, Garmeng, Liang, and Hannah Klein for their help in putting this together. And I want to thank our 3AF team, Sandra Nguyen, Iris Yim, and Bonnie Curtis for their help today. Some of you have asked if we're going to be sharing the presentation deck. We will be sending a follow-up email later today or maybe in the morning with some really good links, a link back to the Pew Center's research page. So you'll get a lot of good information there, or feel free to reach out to me or Neil if you have any other questions. And then 2 more things. We will be sending out a save the date for our May summit, largest national conference focusing on the Asian consumer. So be sure to look out for that. Those of you who are on our email list, you'll get the notice about it so you can save the date. May probably will be hybrid in Los Angeles. And then again, feel free to reach out to the 3AF. We have many members who are experts in the field. Some of us who have been around for 30 plus years doing Asian advertising, Asian marketing, and we're a great resource for you. So don't be shy, reach out to all of us at 3AF. We're here to help. So again, thank you all. It's noon. Have a great day. Thank you for joining our webinar today.
Thank you.
Thank you.